March 8th, 1989, exactly at 11:47 at night, in an abandoned hacienda 20 kilometers from Medellin, a man is kneeling on the packed dirt floor with his hands tied behind his back, bleeding from at least 5 different wounds, breathing with difficulty while trying to come to terms with the fact that of the 12 men who entered with him in that operation, 11 are dead, scattered around the property. His name is Carlos Mejia T. He has worked for the Cali cartel for 7 years, and exactly 4 hours earlier, he believed he was taking part in the best-planned operation in the history of Colombian drug trafficking. The operation that would finally end Pablo Escobar. Now he is there as the sole survivor, waiting to find out whether he will die like the others, or if Pablo has something different in store for him. 3 weeks before that night, on February 15, 1989, brothers Gilberto and Miguel Rodriguez Orejuela were sitting in a meeting room in Cali, discussing what had become their obsession over the last 2 years: how to eliminate Pablo Escobar. The Cali cartel and the Medellin cartel had coexisted for years in a tense but functional relationship, each controlling its own routes and territories. However, Pablo had broken that balance irreversibly by beginning to expand his operations into areas that the Rodriguez brothers considered exclusively theirs. There were conversations, attempts at negotiation, proposals for territorial division, but Pablo had rejected all of it with that characteristic arrogance that made it clear he did not negotiate with anyone, he simply took what he wanted. So the brothers made a decision. If Pablo would not agree to coexist, then Pablo had to die. The problem was that killing Pablo Escobar was not like eliminating any other man in the business, because Pablo had built around himself a security system that seemed impenetrable. He slept in different places every week. He traveled in convoys of armored vehicles. He had informants infiltrated into practically all Colombian security agencies. And most importantly, he had a network of loyalty based on terror and money that made it extremely difficult to find someone willing to betray him. The Rodriguez brothers had tried bribery, they had tried infiltration, they had even tried to hire a man named Papel a few months earlier, and that had failed spectacularly. Each failed attempt only reinforced Pablo's image as someone untouchable, and that was beginning to affect the reputation of the Cali cartel. Because in the Colombian underworld, the inability to eliminate a rival was seen as a sign of weakness. It was Miguel Rodriguez who proposed the operation that would change everything, or at least that was what they believed. The idea was simple, but brutal. Instead of attempting a silent approach or a covert assassination, they would do the opposite. They would form a frontal assault group with 12 of the best hitmen from the Cali cartel, trained and heavily armed men, and send them all at once to a property where they knew Pablo would be on a specific date. The strategy consisted of overwhelming any defense through numbers, speed, and absolute firepower, turning it into a military operation instead of a covert assassination. Gilberto was initially reluctant because the operation was expensive, risky, and if it failed, it would declare an irreversible open war. But Miguel argued that the war was already declared, that Pablo simply had not yet decided to escalate it, and that waiting longer would only give Pablo more opportunities to strengthen himself. The 12 men were personally selected by Miguel over 2 weeks. Each one had a proven record. They had participated in high-risk operations. They knew how to work as a team and, most importantly, each one had personal reasons to want Pablo dead. Some had lost family members in Medellin cartel attacks, others had unfinished business, and others simply because the money offered was enough to buy absolute loyalty. Carlos Mejia was among them not because he was the most violent or the most skilled, but because he was methodical. He followed orders without questioning and possessed a rare characteristic in that type of operation. He knew when to withdraw, he knew the difference between courage and suicide. Miguel liked that about him. He liked having at least one man in the group who thought before shooting, even if the other 11 were pure adrenaline and aggression. Training began on February 20th, 1989, on an isolated property on the outskirts of Cali. Miguel Rodriguez had hired two former military men, a Colombian who had served in the regular army and an Argentine who claimed to have trained special forces, to prepare the 12 men during 2 intensive weeks. The training covered everything: coordinated entry into fortified properties, fire suppression techniques, radio communication under pressure, and most importantly, how to act when the original plan collapses and improvisation is necessary to survive. Carlos absorbed each lesson with almost obsessive seriousness, taking mental notes, asking technical details, while some of the other men treated it almost like a game, as if they were invincible just for being 12 against 1. That made Carlos uncomfortable, but he said nothing. He simply kept training, and waited for when the real moment arrived. Adrenaline and survival instinct would speak louder than arrogance. Intelligence about Pablo's location came from a source the Rodriguez brothers had cultivated for months, an accountant who worked for one of Pablo's shell companies and had access to logistical information. On March 1st, that accountant reported that Pablo would be at a specific hacienda on the outskirts of Medellin on the night of March 8th, for a meeting with European suppliers, and that he would remain there at least until midnight because the meeting included product tasting and price negotiation, something that always lasted longer. The information seemed solid. It had too many specific details to be a trap, and Miguel decided that this was the opportunity they had been waiting for. The plan was refined down to the smallest detail. The 12 men would arrive in 3 cars at 10 at night, park 500 meters from the property, advance on foot in tactical formation, silently eliminate the external guards, and then storm the main house with everything they had, not giving Pablo time to react or escape. On March 7th, one day before the operation, Miguel gathered the 12 men for the final briefing. He was visibly tense, smoking cigar after cigar, and his voice carried a weight Carlos had never heard before. Tomorrow you are going to make history. You are going to achieve something that dozens of men tried and failed to do. But I need you to understand one thing. Pablo Escobar is not an ordinary target. He is possibly the most dangerous man in Colombia, and underestimating him means dying. So I want total discipline. I want you to follow the plan exactly as we trained it, and if something goes wrong, I want you to prioritize survival over ego. Miguel looked directly at each one of the men. I am paying you $50,000 each, alive or dead. Your families will receive $10,000, so do the math and choose to live. Carlos felt a chill run down his spine because, for the first time since accepting the operation, he understood that Miguel considered it possible, even likely, that some of them would not return. March 8th, 1989, 7:15 at night. The 12 men were gathered in a warehouse on the outskirts of Cali, making final preparations. Each one carried a mini Uzi submachine gun, a backup pistol, 6 extra magazines, 2 radios, and a bulletproof vest that Miguel had obtained through military contacts. Carlos checked his equipment 3 times, tested the radio, adjusted the vest, and watched the other men do the same with varying levels of nervousness. Some were silent, focused, others talked too much, laughed too loudly, clearly trying to hide fear with bravado. At 8 at night, they got into the 3 cars, 4 men in each vehicle, and began the 3-hour journey to Medellin. Carlos was in the second car, sitting in the back seat, looking out the window and thinking about his 5-year-old daughter, whom he had left sleeping that morning without knowing if he would return to see her grow up. At 10:20 at night, the 3 cars stopped on a dirt road exactly 500 meters from the hacienda, where Pablo Escobar was supposedly located. From where they were, they could see lights on in the main house, 2 vehicles parked in front, and at least 3 men patrolling the outer perimeter. Everything looked exactly as intelligence had described, which was reassuring but also slightly suspicious. Because according to Carlos's experience, when an operation looks too perfect, it usually means something is being overlooked. They got out of the cars silently, checked their weapons one last time, and began advancing in formation. 6 men on the left and 6 on the right, using dense vegetation as cover. The leader of the operation was a man named Hector, a veteran of at least 20 similar operations, and it was he who gave the order by radio when they reached 50 meters from the fence. Team A, neutralize the south guard. Team B, wait for my signal. It was 10:43 at night. The 12 men had neutralized the 3 external guards without firing a single shot, using knives and coordinated work that showed the training had been worth it. Hector gave the signal for the final advance, and they split into 3 groups of 4. One would enter through the front, another through the back, and the third would cover the side windows to prevent escape. Carlos was in the front group with Hector, and when they positioned themselves at the main door, everything seemed to be working perfectly. Too quiet, too easy. Hector counted to 3 with his fingers and kicked the door hard. The door opened easily without resistance, and the 4 men entered with weapons raised, shouting for everyone to get on the ground. But what they found inside made Carlos's blood freeze. The house was empty, completely empty. No furniture, no people, nothing but a table in the center of the main room, with a radio on top playing music softly. It was at that exact moment that Carlos understood the full truth. They had been lured into a trap. Before he could shout a warning, the windows of the house exploded in a rain of glass and dozens of gunshots began coming from all directions at the same time. Hector was hit first, taking at least 5 bullets in the chest that threw him backward, even with the bulletproof vest. 2 other men from the front group fell within the first 3 seconds. Carlos dove behind a concrete wall and began firing back at the windows, without seeing specific targets, only trying to create enough suppressive fire to be able to think. Through the radio, he could hear screams, explosions, and the unmistakable sound of men dying. The rear group had also been ambushed, and, from the noise, the side group was in an equally desperate situation. In less than 2 minutes of combat, at least 8 of the 12 men were already dead or seriously wounded. The ambush had been planned with surgical precision. Pablo was not at the hacienda. He had never been there. Probably the accountant's information had been false from the beginning, or the accountant had been turned without the Cali cartel knowing. What was there were at least 20 of Pablo's men positioned in strategic points around the property, patiently waiting for them to enter the house to close the net. Carlos realized that the only chance of survival was to get out of that slaughterhouse immediately, so he shouted over the radio, "Everyone retreat! Retreat now! It's a trap!" But when he tried to move toward the door, a burst of gunfire passed so close to his head that he felt the displacement of air. He was trapped, cornered behind that wall, with limited ammunition and no visible escape route. It was then that he heard the voice coming from an outside loudspeaker, a calm, almost friendly voice, which he immediately recognized as Pablo Escobar's. "Gentlemen of the Cali cartel." Pablo's voice echoed across the property with that casual tone that was more terrifying than any direct threat. "I appreciate your courage, I truly do. 12 men against me, that shows ambition. But it also shows that the Rodriguez brothers have learned nothing in recent years. Do you think I did not know about this operation? I knew it before you knew it. The accountant has worked for me for 2 years. Every detail you received was information I allowed to reach you." Pablo paused, and Carlos could hear him lighting a cigarette through the loudspeaker. "Now you have a simple choice. Drop your weapons. Come out with your hands on your heads, and maybe, just maybe, some of you will see the sunrise tomorrow, or continue shooting and guarantee that everyone dies here tonight. You have 1 minute to decide." Carlos looked around at the destroyed room. He saw Hector dying on the ground, trying to breathe with his lungs perforated. He saw the other 2 men from his group clearly dead, and over the radio he only heard silence and static, which meant the other groups had been completely eliminated. He had 2 options: die there trying to fight impossible odds, or surrender and accept whatever fate Pablo decided. His hand trembled, holding the Uzi. His breathing was rapid, and for the first time in 7 years living that life, he felt true fear. Not fear of dying, but fear of dying for nothing, of becoming just another body in a statistic of the cartel war. He dropped the weapon to the ground, removed his bulletproof vest, raised his hands above his head, and walked slowly toward the door, shouting, "I surrender! Don't shoot! I surrender!" When he came out of the house, 7 rifles were aimed at his head at the same time, and a voice that was not Pablo's ordered, "On the ground, face to the earth, hands behind your back." Carlos remained face down on the ground for almost 30 minutes before being placed on his knees in front of Pablo Escobar. Pablo was sitting on a wooden chair in the center of the field, as if he were in a business meeting, dressed in jeans and a white t-shirt, completely relaxed. He looked at Carlos for a long moment without saying anything, just studying that bloodied man who survived when 11 did not. "What is your name?" Pablo asked. "Carlos Mejia," he replied in a dry voice. Pablo shook his head. "You are the only one who surrendered. The other 11 died shooting, which is brave but stupid. You dropped your weapon, which is intelligent." Pablo stood up and slowly walked around Carlos. "You are alive because I needed a messenger. I could have sent a letter, but a man who survived and saw what you saw tonight is a messenger the Rodriguez brothers will listen to carefully." Pablo stopped in front of him and crouched down to eye level with Carlos. "So I am going to give you a message to take to Cali, and you are going to repeat every word exactly as I say it." Carlos nodded, and Pablo began speaking with that controlled voice that did not need volume to be terrifying. "You are going to tell Gilberto and Miguel that the accountant they used as a source has worked for me since 1986, and that every operation planned against me in the last 3 years I knew before they did." Pablo lit a cigarette before continuing. "You are going to say that I am not angry. Anger is a waste of energy. And you are going to say that I have a proposal. If they want to continue this war, every time they send men against me, I will send double back. But if they want to talk, they should send a representative to a neutral meeting, unarmed, just conversation." Pablo looked at Carlos. "Can you remember all that?" Carlos replied, "Every word, Mr. Escobar." Carlos Mejia arrived in Cali on the morning of March 9th, 1989, bloodied and carrying a message that completely changed the dynamics between the two cartels. The Rodriguez brothers listened to every word in absolute silence, and when Carlos finished, Gilberto stood up looking at the table before saying, "He knew everything from the beginning." That realization weighed more than any military defeat, because it meant that Pablo had not only won that battle, he had turned the very attempt at elimination into a demonstration of power. In the following months, the Cali cartel reduced its operations, not out of fear, but from the recognition that attacking a man who is always 3 steps ahead is simply a slower form of destruction. Carlos lived 20 more years after that night, working in a mechanic shop in Barranquilla, always away from any involvement with cartels. He rarely spoke about what had happened, and when someone asked, he always answered with the same phrase that summed it all up. "I was sent to kill a man and returned with a lesson that no school teaches." The 12 men sent by the Rodriguez brothers did not lose because they were weak. They lost because they were playing a game whose rules Pablo had written years before. And that was the heaviest truth Carlos carried for the rest of his life. Not the fact of having survived, but the certainty that from the moment they left Cali, only one ending was possible, and Pablo knew exactly which one it was. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to subscribe to the channel, like, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next videos. Tell us in the comments from which place you are watching this video. We love knowing from which part of the world fans of real crime stories follow us. Thank you very much for watching and see you next time.